So I will kick this off with just a quick introduction. Cindy Meisner, she's our HR consultant. We've been working with her past 9 months to a year. She's been doing work for us on our wage scale analysis and developing a wage scale for the town. She's building on the work that Greg did in 2022, I think. Just recent work. I'm sure you all remember that. Before that, we didn't have any kind of wage scale or wage program ahead of that. And I feel that, the work that Greg did was great, and it maybe got us 85–90% there. And we brought Cindy in just to, check that analysis and, make up that last, 15–20% for us and get us in a really good spot. So we're competitive with our similar type communities who we actually oftentimes can compete with for employees, while also developing a plan for our staff to be able to outline to them specifics on how you can move up those wage scales. So that was a real quick synopsis there. I hope I was pretty accurate there, but I'll hand it over to Cindy from here, and she has a little PowerPoint prepared. And with your permission, Mr. Mayor, I'll hand it over to Cindy.
Yes, please.
Great. Well, good evening, and thank you for having me. I am looking forward to kind of walking through the work that Carlos and I have been doing over the last several months, and have a PowerPoint presentation to walk through. Please, if you have questions, feel free to interrupt. I don't want it to be too formal. If you have things you'd like to discuss, we can certainly do that. This will just kind of serve as a way to walk through the presentation. But let me share my screen here, and we will get started. Hopefully we... And let's see, do I need to swap? No. All right, so do you see my title page? Okay. Does that come through?
We're not.
Okay. Let me go back to... How about that?
No.
No, I'm losing my share screen. Do I have permission to share?
And if you want to email it, is it the same thing you did? Carla sent it to me.
Okay, this might, I think I'm connected now here. So let's try this again.
We are good. We can see it.
Okay. So thank you. Okay, great. So also just by way of quick introduction, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the Employers Council, but just by way of introduction around the council, we've been around a long time. We are one of the largest employer associations across the nation, and we cover several states and provide HR services. We have a team of attorneys that help us with employment law. We provide training and development. We also publish salary survey and benefit data, and provide specialized fee for service types of consulting. So I have been with the council over 20 years, primarily with the compensation consulting group. And I know the town has utilized the council services in other capacities. This is the first opportunity I've had to work with Carlos, and have enjoyed, like I said, just looking over what you had to start with, and really trying to analyze where you wanted to be and how we could get there. So again, feel free to jump in with any questions. In terms of the initial objectives, kind of those overarching objectives that we started out with, was, like Carlos mentioned, you had a first step. You had a previous town manager that put a step structure in place for all of the town's positions. And that was generated from looking at market data through the Colorado Municipal League survey. That data, from what I understand, was kind of reflective of 2019. But that structure that was proposed and implemented was then updated. And so everything was moved forward with an adjustment factor in 2022 of about 6.2%. So that's great. What was started was definitely continued to be moved with market. We all know the market is continuously moving. So Carlos wanted to have me take a look at what was in place, have some dialogue and discussion to get input and feedback from department heads on their positions and those that are working for them, and how we could establish some criteria that would be applied to administer pay moving forward in an equitable, fair way. And what criteria, meaning how we would advance, how to communicate to employees that they have kind of progression, career progression, and the pay opportunity that they have. So it was really to kind of look at what you had and then try and develop some approaches to your pay administration that would be consistent. So that's kind of where we started. As I spoke and talked with Carlos and spoke with department heads and understood the positions a little bit more in the historical context of compensation, which went from nothing really, but then to some form and function with the STEP plan, was that, and for those of you that obviously are familiar with public sector, STEP plans have historically been very common, but are not really continually as common or really competitive a pay practice. But they can be very effectively used and are continually competitive in certain areas. And so what I suspected and what I determined was that the STEP advancement criteria is very useful and effective for the police group, as well as for your parks maintenance and your maintenance departments. So when we look at what others are doing in the public sector, our compensation surveys, specifically for protective services like fire and police, we find that for police, since generally those folks are advancing each year by one step, that having a step structure for police that's really more than 6 or 7 steps isn't really servicing that department very well. So on average, we find that police and fire protective services use between 6 and 7 steps. And that really is to advance maybe someone who's coming in with, at minimal training within 3 or 4 years, moving those 3 or 4 steps to a market rate, a going rate for what that job requires. So having a 10-step plan, which was what was in place, really required, 5 years to get to market, and then beyond just a slower progression of pay opportunities. So quickly identified that, police, I think it still makes sense to have a step plan. I wanted to reduce the number of steps for that group. And then looking at parks and maintenance, absolutely working with Bobby and understanding the criteria, the job requirements, the licensure certification, whether it's a CDL or it's looking at the Road Scholar, or even job requirements about knowing the plow routes, that we can identify specific and consistent criteria for advancement within a step plan. So I felt like that still made a lot of sense for your parks and maintenance jobs. The challenge that I see that you would have if you continued with a one-step structure program for all of the town's jobs is that it's kind of like a one-size-fits-all. So it's better than having nothing, but for your administrative staff and your department heads, really a more competitive practice is to develop individual job-based ranges for those positions so that we can develop administration guidelines to move them through their range, but it also ties that market pay more precisely to the job that they're doing. So skills that are required to do their job, their actual job functions, their qualifications, education, degrees, and that kind of thing, to be able to say, this is what the job is worth outside the market, and really tie that more specifically to each individual job. Any questions here? Okay. So in terms of then kind of looking ahead at what we wanted to accomplish, was another foundational piece to a compensation program, a successful one, is to develop a philosophy. And so not having that, we wanted to set out to develop a compensation philosophy that these pay structures would be supported by, and then update those step structures for maintenance, parks, and police, but use a little bit more current data. So we use 2023 Colorado Municipal League data. And again, like I mentioned, to reduce the number of steps in the police plan, and address an appropriate differential between the top police officer step and then the sergeant step plan, to make sure that there was some internal integrity with how that progression happened. That was missing in the previous step plan. And then develop those administrative guidelines around how we move people through their steps, based on the job criteria and credentialing that we had established are really important for the roles. And then propose individual job-based ranges for your administrative staff and the department heads. And then be able to also evaluate your current pay practices and look at a comp ratio, which is the relationship between someone's current pay and that market midpoint, which is the going rate for that job out in the market, and then a place in range or a range penetration. Based on the time they have in their role, are they appropriately placed in that range? And we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then also to develop some administrative guidelines about how we administer pay for those individuals in their individual job-based ranges. So in, like I mentioned, in looking at a pay system, we want to try and develop a philosophy. So obviously the paycheck is not the only compensation that the town provides your employees. So I want to talk a little bit about a broader topic in terms of total rewards, or you may know it as total compensation. Really lays the foundation for your pay program. And many of you may be familiar with some of these elements, but these are really the elements that keep people where they're at and happy with the town, and your ability to attract people to the town. And oftentimes when we talk about compensation or pay with employees, obviously we think of the paycheck, and the base pay is the biggest kind of recognizable component of this. But as you can see, there are other factors and elements that kind of are symbiotic and work together with their paycheck to make them satisfied and to make the town an employer of choice in the area. Benefits are another big piece of this. Oftentimes, and especially over the last few years, where we've seen the economy go wacko with inflation and the labor market tightening, we have to have good benefits along with pay. The town offers, all of these, and we definitely want to leverage those in terms of being able to understand them and communicate them so that people know the value of working at the town. It's not just that compensation base pay paycheck. So just like to keep this in mind as this project is focused on base pay, but understanding that all these other elements, work together in our total rewards program. So when we talk about a philosophy statement and developing a philosophy, there's some elements to that are important. I think one thing to make sure I want to clarify is that a philosophy statement does not have to be a state of the union or a statement of the conditions now. It can be aspirational. So where the town may not necessarily be where they want to be, let's say, they can certainly in their philosophy statement, indicate that what their goals and what they're striving for in their pay plan. So it may be a phased in approach, or, if it can't all happen at once, it's something to work towards. So obviously, whatever pay system you put in place has to support your mission and values. So that's a big part of your philosophy. And then another part of it is your market position. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a little more detail, but where do you need to be in the market, and how you want to present that, whether that is the state of where you are, or where you are now, or where you want to be. And then also just that it defines how you're going to get there and what criteria you're going to use. Obviously, the business conditions and your ability to pay have to factor in. So it's really creating principles that you are going to use to administer your pay plan. And it becomes very important that employees understand, so that when questions come up, it can be used, this filter can be used to have decisions made in pay. When I talk about market position, obviously the most common, and again, because of just what we've gone through over the last several years with the pandemic and inflation and the labor market, is a competitive market position. Obviously, you're paying at market you're paying the going rate for the job. Alternatively, you might have a lead market philosophy where you're going to set your pay at 75th percentile of market, above that competitive mid rate. Or we don't see this right now, but in the past, maybe you have a lag philosophy where your base pay is not going to be as robust, but you're going to offer very generous benefits. And so you're leveraging in that way. So a lag market position is not unheard of, but it's not very common at this point. So we definitely see more competitive or lead market. And most of this comes down to what's the market for the town's jobs, and where do you need to be in that market? We look at who do you hire from and who do you lose to when we look at how we factor your pay and really setting you up to be the most competitive as possible. But obviously, ultimately, too, what can the town afford? It has to be financially feasible and within your ability to pay. As you may know, we also have pay equity in Colorado, where we now have the Equal Pay Act to have definite visibility and reference for that fact that we need to make sure and ensure that we have equitable pay systems. So with all that said, Carlos and I kind of worked on a proposed draft of what possibly could be the town's total rewards philosophy. I don't think I'll read this to you right now. We can provide it to you for reference, but really trying to hit on those key areas where we're stating what the town endeavors to pay. And obviously, we've set it to be competitive, and that it would support your mission and values, that it would be at market, and that it would be an equitable pay system. So I think this is an important start, and a place where it ties into not just your base pay, but also your benefits. And looking with what I understand, that you do have a very solid, comprehensive benefit package as well. Any comments, questions here before we move on? Okay, so when we talk about, oh, yes.
I have one question, and if this isn't the right spot, I can sure wait on it. And realize reading the total rewards philosophy, it all makes sense to me. But as part of this, if you have any tips for how we market this to current and future employees, getting them to the total rewards concept versus the base pay, I know that's a trick for everyone, but it seems like I think we're strong in a lot of areas, but especially in the total rewards. And so I'd be curious if you have any thoughts how we
No,
can-
great question. Good place for it too. Absolutely. So when we talk about total rewards, it is important to educate and communicate that to employees. Most employers pull together a total rewards statement so that each employee sees the value of their base pay, the cost and the value of their insurance benefits, their retirement, paid time off. So that total compensation value is actually communicated to the employee. So that's definitely something to consider if you haven't at this point, and it's a good time if you're transferring, implementing something new, to be able to say, as a part of this, we want to make sure that you understand the total rewards that we provide at the town, and so that they understand the value of that. And there's different ways to do that. We have some total reward statements, that we can help you put together, but it definitely is a big part of that communication and awareness for employees to appreciate that total compensation piece.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right, so moving on, when we look at kind of your comparison group, previously when the previous town manager used the CML survey, there was a group, a selected comparator group that was established. Carlos and I looked at that, reviewed it, and this slide represents the 21 entities that are representative of resort area communities that, as you can see, not all are equal in terms of the population, the number of employees, and the total budget, but serve to be a reference point, those that you possibly could lose employees to or hire employees from. If we were to only look at a very small portion of the number that are maybe most similar to where town of Mount Crested Butte is, we wouldn't have a very good sample size. And part of gathering data is to get as large a sample size as possible to be representative of rates that are truly being paid. So without going, beyond and using the entire state or some other geographic location, we focused on the data for these entities. You'll notice beside Aspen and Steamboat Springs, we just wanted to pay attention to the data when we looked at the jobs. If the data was an extreme outlier, in other words, that data was significantly higher than the data set that was representative in this group of entities, then we excluded that as an outlier. That's a very common practice in comp. Sometimes you exclude the low outliers and the high, but in this case, we definitely didn't want to use any data that was significantly out of range. So these entities made up the comparison group that we used for the 2023 CML survey data. So when we took a look at the data and the structures, the step structures for maintenance and parks and police.
One moment.
Yes.
I think we had a question.
Oh,
Well,
sure.
I'm looking at all the comps there, and the one comp that's missing is us.
Very top.
Yeah, you're at the very top. We generally don't include the organization itself in the computation of the market data point. That's just generally left. Obviously, we're definitely reviewing your current pay practices against what this market average is, but we don't typically include you in the sample size.
My apologies, I need some different glasses. What was not yellow?
Correct. Yeah, Mount Crested Butte is up here. Let me see if I can get my it's up here with the in the gray at the very top.
My biggest takeaway, sorry, I've got to pull them out from this sheet, was where we compare budget wise to some of the other municipalities, we're kind of on that lower range. And I think we did take.
Kinda.
I think we're second to last.
What's their police force? Some of those other places.
So, and that doesn't necessarily, I think it still makes the comps valid, but, for example, let's just take Crested Youth, and I'm not gonna get the numbers exactly right, but our community development department is 4 people. And theirs is 9, probably because they can afford to pay 9, but on a comp level, our comparative staff person should still be paid at a comparative price. So it doesn't tell the whole story, but it does tell limitations of what we have for wages, given our limitations of budget.
Well, thank you for that.
Yeah.
That, I'm clear now than, yes, thank you.
Right, and just to add to kind of what Carlos was speaking to, again, looking at the representative data set, for the most part, for a job and the skills that are required to do that job, there was large consistency across all these entities, whether it was Vail versus, Salida. So obviously that's where we look for those outliers that don't really fit the data set. But generally, like you said, there's a going rate for a specific level of job skills and the experience and requirements that are required to do that job at that midpoint market rate. So good. Okay. So looking at step structures and the data that we pulled from the 2023 survey, the step structures did not include the department heads. We'll talk about those when we get to the job-based structures, but this is the step structure, 10 steps representing the maintenance and park workforce. And you'll notice some, I know it's probably not easy to read from this screen, but just to kind of generally explain a step structure, you want to make sure that you have fairly consistent spreads between each step. So in this case, you'll see that we have a wider differential, a wider gap between steps in the lower end of the steps. And then that evens out at midpoint, that market step. That's the going rate for the job where you're fully proficient. You have acquired all the skills and knowledge you need to do that job. And then the step increase is more consistent and less than what it was in that top half of the steps. We also like to pay attention where we've got a level. We've got a level 1, a 2, and a 3 to the amount of differential between that market step, between the market step for level 1, 2, and 3. Right now it's at about 21%. And then when we look at what's that spread between that minimum rate and the top rate, we use the market rate to drive that mid-market step. And then we establish a range around that of 40%. So like I mentioned, great job requirements and criteria established for where someone might come in, at which step they might land on, and how they would then advance through the steps. We really want to encourage people to acquire all the skills they can so that they can be the most contribution to the town, not having a huge staff, but for everyone to be trained as deeply and as much breadth in their abilities as possible to perform that maintenance and parks role. Any questions on this particular step structure?
I more have an inquiry about having a range based on performance with each step. I mean, just physically being around, to me as a business owner, doesn't mean you're advancing on the pay scale.
Right. So great question, great point. Part of the, I think, challenge and difficulty with step structures over time and over kind of historically why they are no longer as competitive or common a practice is that if you move someone through a step structure, one step for each year they're in their role, then it becomes a challenge for that entitlement attitude. I don't really have to do much. I just have to be in my seat another year and do what, the bare minimum. The difference with what we've set up for the town, and which honestly is the common practice for using a step structure these days, is not just that it's the time, the 1 year at a current step to move to the next. It's tied to accomplishment and meeting criteria that now involve specific job requirements. Like I mentioned, maybe it's the plow routes, maybe it's the road scholar level certification, maybe it's supervisory responsibilities, so that it isn't just moving each year one step up. It's really that plus attaining certain job skills and credentialing that help you move. And again, the incentive is to really get people to move quickly from a level 1 into a 2, and then, even into the 3 level, where we've got individuals that are performing a wide range of duties because of that, them attaining those job skills, knowledge, and certifications.
Well, that's sounding like a step and lane system, which I'm not seeing where those skill requirements are being reflected.
And those are in the administrative guidelines that we've established that are set. I didn't put a slide in here for those, but worked with Bobby and Tim before he left in Parks to establish the criteria that's set for someone who comes in at step 1, depending on their experience and their knowledge of the job, maybe from a previous role, and then how they can move in advance, not just 1 step every year, but possibly 2 if they've acquired that additional credentialing or attainment of some skill.
So is there an opportunity for no movement with no continuing education or accreditation?
So that everyone will move through based on their service, their length of service. So everyone will move each year for each year of service, but the opportunity to move more quickly through the steps is presented by their initiative to accomplish those additional requirements or certifications.
But again, if they don't do those other things and just are simply around, then they get the steps in 5 years. So there's no check and balance the other way.
You could do nothing and still get advanced.
In theory, you might get, fired or.
Yeah, that's,
I think that's where the town manager comes into play, or the department
And
head.
the department head,
Yeah.
I speak to my department, I have it set. You're not gonna just sit there.
Right, and I've seen that in your reports, so-and-so went to this training, so-and-so got this accreditation, we did this skills thing, I see that all the time, but ultimately, we're approving this. And I would imagine we would need to encourage movement, stagnation, if no one, just being around should not mean somebody's.
Well, and again,
100% agree with that.
and I think that falls to me as the manager to make sure that doesn't happen. And on top of what Nate's saying, I wouldn't go over his head and give one of his officers a raise. If we look at numbers and say, oh, someone's eligible to move up the step, I would talk to Nate and say, this is what the time frame is showing us, but how do you feel about this employee? And if he says, I don't think they earned that progression, then that's all I would need to hear to.
So there is an opportunity for them not to move a step just for being around you.
I would say so.
I can see in my department, I
Sure.
can't speak to Bob.
Yeah.
and so help me out also with why is it that we're not looking at department heads in this as well?
There's three proposed, scales that we're looking at. Two are step scales. One is for parks and maintenance, which you have here. Next will be the PD. And then the rest will be the administrative staff, and the administrative staff includes the police chief, Bobby, and Addison as heads of parks. So they're treated differently, as administrative staff.
Okay.
Exhibit.
Right. So these maintenance levels, 1, 2, and 3, the first, obviously an entry level worker, hopefully pushing everyone towards at least that second level, but then also the senior lead is more of capturing some supervisory responsibilities and training that's required to reach that level.
And to back up just a little bit, the purpose of tonight was to get this in front of you so you see it and digest it, provide some feedback on it, with the hope of bringing it back in 2 weeks for adoption. And it's not to say what we're presenting tonight is final. It is a demonstration of all the work that we put into this date, but again, it's an opportunity for you to see it first before we take it for adoption.
And I'd be curious, this might be a council discussion or a discussion with Jerry, but where does our sort of influence on how this program is set up sort of end and our managers picks up, you know, where, how much structure are we intended or able to influence?
I mean, I think this being the structure of the program, I do think that's our, you know, a function of our oversight, but I agree with Janet to your question about that odd, hopefully odd person that's just stagnating. That I do think that's their direct supervisors. And then I think that this structure does a few things. I guess I've always viewed it as if you're motivated employee and you want to do better and you want to advance, this lays out the steps for you so you can see it and you know what you got to get next to advance to the next step. I hadn't thought a ton about what you said, but I think it provides.
Thank you.
Guidance. Well, no, I mean, I appreciate you bringing that up because it's just not something that when I was looking at this, and I know you're joking. But I think it also provides sort of an expectation as well. So if you are that, like, I'm just gonna do the minimum amount possible and I'm gonna advance in my job by the sheer passage of time. The fact that this exists and there's further steps ought to be a clue to everyone that if you're not sort of moving the ball and advancing and getting your continuing education and improving in your job, that maybe this isn't the job for you, or maybe this isn't the place for you to work.
Yeah, and so the framework, I think, is right. I think since it doesn't exist, or it's rather fledgling in a certain way, you, as the council, set the framework, and then the charter does empower the town manager to then implement it.
So to be clear, this would be this 8% step for 5 years until they're fully sort of not vested, but brought up to speed with their skills to be fully proficient in their job. And during that time, they're also making the cost of living increase as well.
They are, but with those, you adjust the wage scale accordingly.
Right. So we can't put these in place and let them set. We would adjust the market, that step 5 for the step structures. We would adjust the market midpoint, whether it's doing in-depth market study work or whether it's using indexes that are provided by the Bureau of Labor and Statistics on the cost of labor movement, the cost of living, the CPI index, using those to project a flat adjustment that we would make, similar to how the previous town manager applied the 6.2%, just to keep the structures moving forward with market.
Maybe I didn't ask it right. So somebody's hired now under this, and they're at the midpoint. For 5 years, they'll be making a 14% increase if they're on pace with being more proficient in their job, because it's an 8% increase for the step and then a 6% cost of living increase.
Well, I think cost of living would go across the board.
Right.
And you would adjust the pay scale across the board to reflect that, right? Adjust the market. And then, you know, feasibly, I guess that could happen, but then the discretion lies with the manager on how quickly, or if at all, that particular, and the department head, and how that particular, employee moves up that scale.
I get the nuance of that, but using that chart in front of us,
Mhm.
the top line. It would be that step plus the cost of living increase, and then that next step. Based on that base pay, plus the cost of living increase.
Oh, and I wouldn't look at it as plus the cost of living, it's the cost of living is an adjustment. And that adjustment happens to the whole thing, and then when that adjustment happens, then that individual employee would then take a step based on that adjustment. So, to what you're saying, yes, but I would describe it slightly different. Yeah.
I'm, in the dark, I'm not real clear, you know, we're talking about, market. And when I look at the 21, you know, different, municipalities, market to me would, you know, comps to me would be comparable budgets. And we are being comped against Aspen and, you know, all these other entities that have, you know, widely varying budgets. How do we, you know, because our budget is X% of Y's, we would, you know, say, you know, that, well, their comparative, what the weight of their budget is, you know, like 12 times ours, so we're.
They oftentimes-
You know, where my confusion is in, where do we peg ourselves in that market there? And, you know, are we using a percentage, or how are we actually defining our market position?
Well, do you wanna go first?
I would say. You know, one of the slides from Cindy talks about your market, you know, who do you hire from and who hires from you? So that's. One way to determine your market, like employees that leave here and take a job somewhere else with another town, that's sort of our market, right?
And in looking at individual jobs across,
They're going to.
Well, no, well, you can't,
We're in the same market.
yeah, we're in the, if they get hired away, let's say we have an employee here, they get hired by the town of Salida. Then Salida's
I
a
got that,
competitor with
Okay.
us.
I'm with you on that.
And then the other part to consider is also the FTE column. So if you're just comparing a budget, you know, you have Steamboat, and again, I know that was listed as an outlier, but I'm still flabbergasted by the budget. 121,000, but they also have 250 employees relative to our 29. And so the number of, you know what I mean? So an employee at Steamboat, a similarly situated employee at Steamboat with their $121 million budget, there's an argument to be made that a person at their town doing the same job as the person at our town should be roughly paid the same, regardless of their budget.
Yeah, and the comp I was trying to make earlier is, let's take Neil and Nate as examples, and use Avon, and I don't know what well, it's right there. $59 million budget. The police chief in Avon probably has similar responsibilities, and the community development director has similar responsibilities, both of our positions. That budget might allow that police chief to have more officers and allow Neil to have more people working under him. But it's still this, and that probably makes some aspects of the job easier and some aspects of the job more difficult. And so again, I think that's the difference in the budget. It's not such a difference in the job itself. It's just that since they have a bigger budget, they have more people to fill that position. And I don't know if we've done this analysis, but I would guess that the percentage of that budget that goes to salary and wages would be somewhat similar.
Yeah, there's.
Is that fair, Cindy? And you should be the one really answering this question as our expert, but
So exactly. So it's important to keep in mind that, again, the data that we're pulling is specifically related to the job and the skills, the job content, qualifications to perform that job. So that a job in one entity, there may be 4 on staff versus where for your town you have 1, but the going rate for that job remains the same. All of these entities are located in a resort area, which brings challenges in terms of cost of living. So that aspect is also kind of filtered into this analysis in terms of not just looking at a similar town or entity that was exactly the same size as town of Mount Crested Butte and exactly the same number of employees. If you were to do that, I think you would put yourself behind the 8 ball in terms of being competitive and having the ability to attract new employees and keep with market.
And
Does that-
we have about 10 minutes left and a handful more slides, so hopefully we can.
Yeah, let's move.
The questions, but.
Well, I would just say too, Dwayne, the goal of all of this is that our compensation packages, what was the term used earlier in the, total rewards?
Total rewards.
Total rewards, yes, thank you, to make our total rewards competitive enough that we're not losing staff members to other places all the time because they offer better, so.
And so how does our, historical turnover factor into all this? Because when I think in terms of, if you really want to know, how well you're doing, look at your turnover.
Well,
And from that perspective, how competitive are we?
well, I think our turnover in the negative hasn't been bad. But we have been able to fill positions from our competitors. We have 2 maintenance people that used to work for the town of MTCB. Neil, he didn't come to us directly, but he used to work with Denison County. So we haven't lost anybody to our competitors, but we have shown our competitiveness by being able to bring people in.
Which is indicative of we're competitive.
I would say no,
What's the time frame?
and I don't think it's just wages, and especially on the
total
PD side
package.
is the culture, if you will, that we have. I don't know, maybe that's not the right word.
Careful.
Yeah. You bet.
No, I can speak on the community side. The councils and the previous council before you have had the foresight to be forward thinking, so we've been always the agency that people want to work for. And I think you're staying ahead of the curve by looking at these things ahead of time. I think there was a big jump with Greg's son here, that helped tremendously. And as the other entities, city of Denison, that's really who I look at as a competitor, the county, the Crested Marshals, my competitors for the Philippines. They're looking at us going, okay, now we got to beat that. And that's what it's doing. The city of Denison is trying hard to take 2 or 3 of our officers.
They recently Crested Butte, and like, we used to have the advantage over Crested Butte with their benefits package. Now they matched our benefits package.
So, and that's kind of why, the reason I'm really here is to thank you guys for taking time to look at this and keeping us competitive. Because it makes my life a lot easier when I'm out hiring all the time. PD, we have our newest officer has been here 5 years. And that's outstanding law enforcement.
Right.
For people to stay at that job in a small town that long.
Yeah.
And our two senior officers are 18, 19.
18, 19 years are
The
senior
key
officers.
is be aware of the competition.
Yeah, and Cindy also had a slide, you can sort of take two positions, you can lead or lag, or I guess it's three positions, you can lead or lag or be in the middle. I think what Nate's talking about is what sort of benefits you get from leading.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, the money you guys have, the town has invested in the officers here is staying here.
yeah,
All that training as they move up the scale or however you're gonna look at it, is staying here. You're getting that back instead of the city council.
The cost of retaining versus cost of hiring new.
That's what I was gonna bring up, the cost to hire new and train those people. I don't know if that's factored into Cindy's.
I was gonna bring that up too, because you hear all of these numbers and they all seem pretty fuzzy, but I think suffice to say it's expensive. And so, there's some numbers out there that if you lose a person, the cost to the organization is 2 to 3 times their annual salary to replace them. And that takes into consideration, the gap in time between someone leaving, the amount of time it takes that person to get trained up, the further amount of time it gets that person to get trained up to the level of the person they're replacing and all of those things. And so I think the argument could be made that keeping up with this, like Nate mentioned, is cost effective, because to the extent we don't lose people, or the cost to lose someone is much more than a annual salary.
Well, I'd just like to encourage us to be aware that obviously there's a sweet spot in this someplace. And, let's embrace the sweet spot and, not make it too, sticky sweet and.
It's all about the sweet spot.
Yeah,
And I think the other thing that we're not really talking about, we don't wanna talk about it and hope doesn't happen, but we could see a huge, we could have a national recession, we could have something crazy that happens. And the amount of money that the town's bringing in is decreased dramatically, and so I think, sort of the flip side that we hope we don't ever have to deal with is that there could be pay cuts, or there could be positions eliminated. And that's what, when Cindy mentions the ability to pay, that's always the bottom line. We're doing this. and
That
we have the
trumps
luxury-
everything, right?
We have
That
the
trumps
luxury of
everything.
offers at the moment, but I've been here in the town when things were different.
me too,
So,
but I ain't worked for the town.
no, but it's just something to keep in mind. This isn't an amount of money that we spend in perpetuity. It is relative to our market and our own finances and all those things. And the other thing too, presumably whatever that disaster isn't gonna just affect us. It's gonna be all these other
Right.
towns in that slide that we had.
So we've got 4 minutes, and the PD steps look pretty straightforward compared to this. I would appreciate getting some guidance on the administrative side.
Sure, let's move on then. So those individual job-based ranges, when we talk about a salary range, we talk about setting that midpoint at market and then establishing the lowest paid rate, the minimum and the maximum around that. You'll see that I've also broken the job-based ranges for each role also into quartiles that represent different parts of the market. So first quartile at that 10th percentile, second quartile 25th, midpoint 50th, third 75th, and that fourth quartile at the 90th percentile of market. So for each of those administrative staff roles and the department heads, we've established a market midpoint reference and then established a 50% spread around that to provide the biggest pay opportunity possible. Obviously, in a small town where everyone's wearing several hats, there aren't, as many opportunities for advancement into another role or to promote necessarily. So we definitely wanted to pay attention and provide a wide pay range around that market midpoint. Any thoughts or questions as we look at this for the administrative staff?
Just trying to figure out the differences between steps and percentiles and quartiles.
So a step plan is that kind of implied entitlement movement of someone through each step. Whereas with a job-based range, part of the analysis of your current pay practices was to establish, and I'm going to jump ahead just to this, we can go back to the other slide, but reviewing your current pay practices to find out what's the comp ratio, what's someone's current pay to where that market rate midpoint is, and then how far have they penetrated the range. So when we look at those quartiles, generally time and position, a first quartile would be more entries, maybe 0 to 2.5, 2 years of experience. Second quartile might be 2 to 5 years of experience. Midpoint, you would have at least 5 years of experience. Third quartile, you'd maybe have 7 or 8 years of experience. And that fourth quartile, looking at maybe 10 years experience. So it's based somewhat on initially on how someone's tenure or time in position sets them, but ultimately they advance through their range based on merit increases or across the board adjustments, whatever the town decides, and that those adjustments would not go beyond the limits of that range that we've established. So no one's base pay would increase beyond the maximum. If they are at the maximum, we would provide a lump sum bonus for that amount beyond the maximum, but their base pay would not change or become any greater than that maximum pay rate. So we looked at the metrics of where people are in relation to this new pay individual job-based ranges. Everyone was paid currently with the 8% adjustment within these newly proposed ranges. There were also individuals where we looked at their time and position so that if you had a 5-year person or a 7-year person and they weren't even to midpoint, that I made some recommendations for how we might move that person to the appropriate place in their range that would be justified by the amount of time they've spent in their position. Certainly performance, obviously, being a big key of any adjustment that they're performing satisfactorily. Does that answer?
Or it's been suggested or?
I'm sorry, recommended.
And so this would be far more the annual review, merit-based increases rather than just the step.
Correct.
Into the guidelines is an annual performance review. So for me, I would do it with the department head, the department heads would do it with their staff. And then we make determinations, on that merit base. What this does is it just provides the experience range. And then you have that experience, they fit within that range of experience and they move within it, within their, based on the merit.
Thank you.
And I will say, in looking at the previous step plan that all of these jobs were previously a part of, in almost every case, the midpoint market rate for their individual job, like I said, that's based on their skills and duties and qualifications. In this previous step plan, their market mid-step was lower. So this establishes a market midpoint for each job based on what the job's doing. Now, that's the value of the job. When we look at pay practices, then we evaluate the individual, the person, and what they bring to the party in terms of their performance and experience. But valuing the job is the first step, so that if you had to turn around tomorrow and recruit a plan or two, we have a market midpoint and a range that has been established based on the market movement and competitiveness of your comparator group. Any other kind of work?
To further just address on that real quick, is they are taking those recommendations. I've talked to the department heads that some of those recommendations apply to, and we've determined if we feel they are justified or not. And so then that will be contingent on tonight and how these things go. And again, as the manager, I have the ability to make those changes. So there could be some adjustments.
And then as we did with the step structures, with this job-based range, we will have administrative guidelines that certainly communicate the philosophy, but also answer questions about how you administer pay through these ranges, and how you move forward with maybe new positions, how we look at evaluating all of that on an ongoing basis. And again, those we've developed and proposed. The general kind of summary of all this is certainly successful programs definitely have to have a credible, consistent, data-driven support. The methodology to explain how we arrived at these recommendations, the findings and our recommendations, and be able to explain it so that employees understand how their pay is being evaluated and how pay decisions are being made. But mostly to be able to give you the competitive edge to attract and retain the staff you need that supports your goals and strategies, but also to maintain this so that we look at each year, where's the market at, what kind of adjustments might we need to make on our market midpoints or our individual market steps and the step structures to keep it current and effective. So
And
that
one
was
last thing to add, I know we've got to go, is it's becoming the trend, at least in Colorado governments, to do these types of studies annually. So we will get used to Cindy. I think we'll be doing this more on a regular basis just to make sure we're staying competitive. It'll aid us in finding that sweet spot. And the biggest part for me for that question is that this is new. We haven't had any kind of payment program for, ever until 2 years ago. So part of it is getting there. And I think what this would ultimately do would get us at that starting point. And we will have those guidelines as part of what we approved next week. We just didn't have it ready in time for this presentation.
Well, thanks for all the work. And here's to keeping us competitive and happy employees and happy town council.
Yeah, no, now that we've got, I know we had to cut it short for questions, but if you have any questions, just reach out to me. We'll get them answered.
I will.
Yes.